May 1941. The British Navy was on a state of high alert. The legendary German warship Bismarck was prowling the North Atlantic. She'd sunk the pride of the British Navy, the mighty HMS Hood, in only 2 minutes. She'd also seriously wounded Britain's newest battleship, the Prince of Wales. In London, the Admiralty issued this now famous order to every ship within striking distance: sink the Bismarck. May 2001, the Imperial War Museum. The 60th anniversary of the great British naval victory, the sinking of the Bismarck. This World War II naval battle has become legendary. The greatest warship afloat, sunk on only the 9th day of her maiden voyage. But behind the myth is a story of epic bravery and blunder. The outcome could have been so very different. Triumph was very nearly disaster.
The last of these actual pictures of the battle shows the Bismarck as smoking ruin.
And over the whole affair hangs a question no one has yet answered. Did the British really sink the Bismarck? Amazingly, some German survivors claimed they sank their own ship. In the summer of 2001, a Channel 4 expedition steamed far out into the North Atlantic to find and film the last resting place of one of the most famous warships of all time, and to probe the mystery of who sank the Bismarck.
This could be, the first bit of debris.
The voyage was part of a hugely ambitious project. Expedition leader David Mearns is a world authority on deep ocean exploration. He became the first person to rediscover Bismarck's victim, HMS Hood. Hood had lain at the bottom of the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland for 60 years. For the first time in history, the team located and filmed the wreck and solved many of the mysteries surrounding her sinking. But Hood lies on a flat underwater plain. Finding and filming Bismarck is an altogether different proposition, despite the fact she's been found before. Bismarck was discovered by American explorer Bob Ballard in 1989, when underwater video technology was relatively primitive. The images of her were unclear, and the survey of the wreck incomplete. It also took over 2 years to find her, and her location was kept secret. David Mearns has since researched all the reported positions for Bismarck's sinking and has come up with a search area 400 miles square. Locating Bismarck again will be hard. She is 3 miles down in one of the deepest abysses of the North Atlantic. However, the previous expedition left a vital clue. Bismarck is said to lie on the deeply ravined side of an underwater volcano. There is only one such geological feature within the area. David is confident of finding Bismarck on the first line through the search box.
Well, I'm going to sit down later, actually, and work through my line strategy, and I'll have a better feel then. But I do think we're going to find it earlier rather than later, and some of that is just going to be a bit of skill, but also a bit of luck as well.
The key to finding the wreck will be one of the most advanced underwater sonar units in the world. It operates at huge depths, scouring up and down the ocean floor with sound waves to create a detailed map of the area. David will then send down the ROV. This remote-controlled submersible will deliver the highest quality video pictures of Bismarck, and they will be used to conduct the first ever comprehensive survey of the wreck. If Bismarck is found, then historian Dr. Eric Grove and underwater forensic expert Bill Durans will help David assess whether the Bismarck was, in fact, sunk by British torpedoes or scuttled by her own crew.
Our inspection of the damage, as far as we can see it along the sides of the ship, should shed some light on how much water she was taking in before the Germans claimed that they opened the seacocks and perhaps even exploded scuttling charges.
The idea of the scuttling charges is controversial. There's some anecdotal evidence from survivors that scuttling charges were installed.
I think actually it fits the German naval mindset, and better to take the ship, to sink the ship yourself rather than even to risk it falling into enemy hands. And it seems odd to us as Anglo-Saxons, but it wasn't odd to the Germans.
But as the research vessel Northern Horizon reaches the search area, the weather threatens to undo David's carefully laid plans.
It's looking a bit angry out there, actually. The sea's starting to get wind whipped, which is not a good sign, and the tops of these swells are being blown over. They're starting to break.
It's rather like it was on the day the Bismarck sank. I mean, you can see in the photographs, you can see that the tops of the swells are being blown by the wind. And you could almost see the Bismarck out there, having seen some of the pictures of the sinking. You could almost imagine her smoking out there and going down. These are very similar conditions.
Yeah, I'd rather it be flat front.
Yes.
I mean,
we don't need the historical accuracy.
Yeah, we don't need it today,
Absolutely,
do we?
absolutely. That's correct.
A Force 10 gale blows up. The team keep their delicate equipment tied to the heaving deck.
But the whole North Atlantic right now is a mess. It's not a place to be. We're ready to go. We're just sort of sitting here holding fire.
The expedition costs tens of thousands of pounds a day. Time is a precious commodity. David's plan to find Bismarck fast is already 3 days behind schedule. The battleship Bismarck was a legend from the day she was launched in 1939. Adored by Hitler, Bismarck was a towering symbol of the technological supremacy of the Third Reich. She was designed to be indestructible and very fast. She was built in secret in Hamburg. At 820 feet long, she was Germany's biggest warship. She was also bristling with 8 15-inch guns. She had 13-inch thick steel armor and a top speed of 30 knots. Bismarck was the quickest and best armored ship of her day. Even as she lay in harbor, she was a drain on the British Navy, who had to cover her every possible move. Let loose in the Atlantic, she would be a lethal threat to the merchant convoy ships supplying Britain. But despite the formidable credentials of his new ship, Bismarck's new commander was not happy. German Admiral Gunther Lütjens was an Atlantic veteran. On a 2-month mission in early 1941, leading the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, Admiral Lütjens sank 116,000 tons of British merchant shipping. Despite being outnumbered 10-1, the German Navy was winning the war at sea. Their strategy was to avoid clashes with warships and instead attack the merchant convoys. Hitler's plan was to starve Britain into submission. But it's not clear that Admiral Lütjens had much faith in his Führer's strategy. The broadcaster Ludovic Kennedy, who took part as a young officer in the action against the Bismarck, believes Admiral Lütjens was at odds with Hitler and Nazism.
When Hitler inspected the Bismarck at Gottenhafen, Admiral Lütjens had the officers arranged on the quarterdeck to receive him, and all the junior officers went like that. But Lütjens gave the old naval salute like that. He wasn't going to kowtow to Nazism.
In fact, Lütjens' own grandmother was Jewish. Gerhard Lütjens was 10 years old when his father left to take up command of the Bismarck.
There were many Jewish officers in the Navy, a great many. Older ones too, who had fought in the First World War. And they were protected. Or some had wives that were Jewish or that sort of thing. Well, you know how the Nazis were completely crazy. But apparently it was possible to be a Jewish officer in the Navy, and many of them were saved.
Admiral Lütjens' own brother had fled to Switzerland at the start of the war. Lütjens' loyalty to the Navy had made him stay, but from the start he had serious doubts.
The armed forces hadn't really realized the war was a total waste of time. Of course, we realized it later. But very early on, my father knew. He had said that we would probably never be able to win this war. He said, we haven't got enough oil and it won't work. But that was the way it was. He was a military man and he did his duty.
Despite his reservations, Lütjens was determined to put on a good show. He proudly inspected the Bismarck and her consort, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. In this film, taken by the propaganda ministry, Lütjens is seen coming on board to meet the crew as they prepared for their maiden voyage. One of those men was Henning von Schultz, the second gunnery officer on board the Prince Eugen.
The mood was excellent. On the 18th of May 1941, we set sail from Gothenhafen and met up with the battleship Bismarck, which was to join us for Operation Rheinübung at Cape Arcona. The commander had assembled the crew and briefed them about the forthcoming mission. He reminded them of their obligation to do their duty, as is the usual practice. He stressed the feeling of belonging together, and we were in such high spirits that the entire crew sang the Prince Eugen battle song.
Finally, after nearly 5 years of building and preparation, the awesome Bismarck slipped out of the Baltic on her maiden voyage. Her mission: to decimate the Atlantic convoys. But Lütjens' new success would depend on how long the ships could remain undetected. Many younger officers, like gunnery officer Baron von Mullenheim-Reckberg, doubted it was possible. He is now 90 years old. In 1936, he was German naval attaché to Great Britain, based in Berkeley Square. Then he served as Admiral Lütjens' adjutant before being posted to the Bismarck as third gunnery officer. After the war, working as a diplomat, he found out that Bismarck had been spotted almost immediately after her departure.
There was an ornithologist, Edward K. Barth, off the south coast of Norway. He was part of the Norwegian underground. He photographed anything of interest that he saw. So on that particular day, he took a photo of the Bismarck and then the Prince Eugen. It is of great historical interest because it shows that we had been spotted several times. So much for remaining undetected.
Admiral Lutyens' preferred route into the Atlantic was north of Iceland through the Arctic. The propaganda film shows the ships entering the ice floes. But unknown to the Germans, the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland had been staked out by two British cruisers, HMS Norfolk and Suffolk. They started to shadow the German ships.
Initially, we had hoped to be able to shake Suffolk off. We tried changing course, heading for patches of fog and so on. Nothing worked. They kept on shadowing us.
The British cruisers sent out the alert. Lurking just off the south coast of Iceland, ready to pounce, were the massive HMS Hood and the brand new battleship Prince of Wales. The Germans had been ambushed. Bismarck's crew leapt into action. The state-of-the-art gunnery swiftly sank the Hood and left the Prince of Wales badly damaged. But as the German gunnery crews cheered, Lutyens was already a very worried man. With his attackers in disarray, Lutyens made for the vast expanse of the Atlantic. But he still couldn't shake off the cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk. They stuck to Bismarck and Prince Eugen like glue. Lutyens suspected that the British cruisers could be using a new long-range radar system that far outperformed the Germans' own. For a huge surface ship like Bismarck in hostile waters, that would be disaster.
Lutyens knew he faced a situation he had not anticipated. He soon decided that waging a hit-and-run war against convoys under such conditions, when there was no means of escaping and no safe means of reaching a tanker, would be senseless. This affected his entire state of mind. It had a negative effect on his whole attitude. He allowed himself to become depressed.
For Lutyens, his mission was over just as it was starting. He was sure he couldn't hide, and he soon found out he couldn't run. Bismarck had been hit by the Prince of Wales below the waterline. She was losing oil. Her speed was down. She had to get back to a safe port. The nearest was over 1,000 miles away. On board the research vessel Northern Horizon, there is good news. A weather window has opened up, hopefully long enough to complete the mission. After days of waiting, expedition leader David Mearns can launch the sonar unit. It will travel 15,000 feet down into the deep ocean to hunt for Bismarck. David is hopeful he will find the wreck on his first sonar pass through the search box.
Yeah, it's just, sort of 3 days of frustration is now released, and now it's, the excitement will build once we get online.
When the sonar is 1,000 feet from the seabed, the ship tows it, using satellite navigation on a perfectly straight line through the search area. The line is 12 miles long. With the ship moving at 2 miles an hour, the first pass goes on well into the night. The sonar generates a split image, showing the terrain to the left and right of the unit. But in the center, the area right underneath the sonar is a blind spot. As the ship gets nearer and nearer to the end of the first line, it seems that the team may have had some bad luck.
Computer here, I can't zoom in, and we're getting something really hard now. Is that red over there?
Yeah, roger.
And that's a bit of a slide, isn't it?
Roger that, man.
Okay. I mean, this is all the sort of telltale signs that you're in the middle of a debris field, and there's some unusual. I mean, these are not sort of unusual.
There are some hints of smaller debris, but strangely no sign of the massive hull.
I have a feeling that it's right in here, and we can't see the wreck, but we're getting everything else. These things are hard coming in, but I can't zoom in on them. I think we go over to the other side.
David runs to the sonar control hut to try and get a closer look at the sonar image.
I can't zoom over there because if I do, it'll crash the way what's going on. But it's like the worst possible situation you could have is just get a hint, but nothing definitive. But then
Yeah, I'm going to start picking up on some cable.
Bismarck's main hull should show up as a large, hard-edged, rectangular image in the sonar sweep. But it's not in there.
I think we're really unlucky, and it's right under the towfish.
The ship turns round to make another pass through the search box. With over 5 miles of cable behind, the turn has to be slow. It's another 12 hours before the sonar will be back over the debris field again. Will Bismarck be in there?
Yeah, we're starting to get some hard bits. This is it. This is the debris field. Look, target's over here as well. Yeah. Look at the size of that. There's a shadow behind that. Here it comes. That's it. 236 meters, that's it.
There you go. Well done. Fantastic.
Nice run. Just another day in the park, isn't it?
Fantastic.
Right, well done.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Right.
David has indeed located the main hull of Bismarck quickly, in less than 24 hours. It also seems to be intact. Bismarck may soon give up answers to a 60-year-old mystery.
We've located the main hull, and
which seems to be the right length.
Yeah, a whole collection of parts that seem to be detached from that, of various rough sizes and shapes and things like that.
In fact, the initial impression from the sonar picture is very, very encouraging. That there's quite a lot to find out, and so I'm very much looking forward to what we find out tomorrow.
The day after Bismarck destroyed HMS Hood was Sunday the 25th of May, 1941. It was also Admiral Gunther Lütjen's 52nd birthday. He received birthday greetings from the Führer himself. He and his ship were commended by Hitler on the dramatic sinking of the Hood. And Lütjens had also just pulled off a tactical masterstroke. The previous day, the cruisers HMS Suffolk and Norfolk and the limping Prince of Wales continued to track Bismarck and Prince Eugen south. Closing in from the east was Commander-in-Chief of the British Home Fleet, Admiral Sir John Tovey. On board the battleship HMS King George V, he was steaming at high speed along with HMS Repulse and the aircraft carrier Victorious. Convoy escorts HMS Rodney and Dorsetshire were diverted to the chase. midnight, Tovey ordered a torpedo attack by the aircraft from HMS Victorious. But they failed to inflict any damage on Bismarck. Then, in an audacious move at night, Admiral Lutyens had his ships separate. Bismarck doubled back into a rain squall and then headed east, while Prince Eugen veered southwest. In the confusion, the new experimental British radar lost both German ships. Bismarck had slipped her pursuers and was alone in the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. Lutyens was in the clear. His intelligence sources intercepted British radio traffic. They reported the British had lost Bismarck. Lutyens didn't believe them. He felt sure British radar must be plotting his every move. He broadcast a long, rambling message to shore, asking for U-boat and air support. It was a fatal mistake. The transmission was immediately intercepted by the British and the now distant Prince Eugen.
We threw up our hands in despair and thought to ourselves, good heavens. The tracking ships must have lost contact with their target. There are no radio messages from them. And now the Bismarck is sending such a long radio message, which will undoubtedly enable the enemy to locate her position.
By intercepting the transmission from Bismarck at various radio stations on land, the Admiralty in London were able to get a rough directional fix on Bismarck's position. It seemed to them she was heading east to German-occupied France. But the data was inconclusive. They decided Admiral Tovey had a better view of the situation. They sent him the raw data to make his own calculations and draw his own conclusions. Unfortunately, on board HMS King George V, Tovey's staff got their calculations back to front. Instead of heading east in pursuit, they turned north, believing she was heading back to Norway. Instead of closing in on their prey, the British were now steaming at top speed in the wrong direction. Yet again, Lutyens was oblivious to his own good luck. At midday, he solemnly addressed the whole crew. It was clear he felt they were doomed to fight a battle which they could not win.
Fleet Commander Lutyens made a very moving speech to the crew on his birthday, the 25th of May, ending with the words, "Victory or death." I was on guard duty at the bow command post. I released my NCOs so they could go and hear his speech. When they returned, they said, good heavens, it's all over."
Soon afterwards, the captain of the Bismarck, Ernst Lindemann, tried to lift crew morale. He told them they were now only 600 miles west of France, soon to be inside Luftwaffe air cover. He assured them they'd make it home. Back in London, the Admiralty were confused by the fact that the British ships pursuing Bismarck had turned north. They thought Tovey must know something they didn't. But their calculations still showed Bismarck heading east to a port in northern France. To make sure, RAF Coastal Command was asked to sweep over the easterly route. The Admiralty's hunch was right. Bismarck was found again. Unfortunately, she was now 150 miles east of the fleet. Tovey's ships would never catch her. Somehow, the German ship had to be slowed down. The northern horizon is on the very spot where Bismarck sank 60 years ago. Expedition leader David Mearns watches anxiously as his team prepare the ROV, the remote-controlled submersible. It will descend to the very bottom of the ocean. From there, it will feed back high-quality images of the hull of the great ship and all the debris that fell off as she sank. With 4 days already lost and the weather outlook uncertain, David wants to start filming Bismarck quickly.
Well, it's just a few more hours, and then we'll see her.
As the ROV heads to the bottom on its 4-hour journey to the Bismarck, at least some of the team can get some sleep. At 1 in the morning, the team come back to the survey room. The ROV is nearly there.
Those are boots.
Yes, those are boots, definitely. Wow.
The ROV has dropped down right on top of the mass of debris. The plan is to progress through it and hopefully locate the main hull of the ship. Only then can the team search its exterior for the signs of the torpedo damage that the British claim sank Bismarck. Or will they find evidence that the Germans scuttled their own ship? As the ROV proceeds forward through the field of debris, it comes across larger and larger pieces. This is part of the range-finding apparatus used to aim the main guns. Cranes and mast parts litter the seabed.
That's a cross tree.
That's that cross tree there.
Yeah.
Then into shot comes a huge piece of debris.
That looks like the mast off the Bismarck.
Yeah.
So,
That's it. To see, to see that you don't have any other inverted cross trees anywhere. I mean, you need that has to be the main mast. No doubt about it.
The main mast of Bismarck lies bent in two, upside down. But the railings and viewing platforms where signalmen and lookouts stood are still visible.
yeah, Dave, we've got a real good hard target dead ahead of us, about 35 feet.
Right. Okay.
You gonna move out?
Go ahead, hit that. My God.
Is that at the bottom of the turret?
No, it's too light, I think. So
The bottom of the turrets. No. Is that a turret inverted?
Whatever it is, it's upside down. That's for sure.
That could be a main turret. I mean, that is a significant...
could it be that big?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
This is indeed one of Bismarck's 1,000-ton gun turrets. As the ship rolled, it would have fallen out and now lies upside down on the seabed. Visible in the center of picture is an open escape hatch. Then into shot looms the biggest piece of debris yet. The superstructure is the main tower of the ship containing the bridge. On this very platform behind these windows stood Captain Lindemann and Admiral Lutyens. Now it lies upside down, having snapped off as one complete piece as the ship sank. But after exploring the field of debris, the team start to draw a blank. The main hull, the ship herself, where all the answers lie, doesn't seem to be in the same area. The search goes on all night and into the next day. This is a challenging terrain. an underwater mountain range rivaling the Alps in size. The team are having to negotiate the deep ravines on the side of the underwater volcano. The ridges along the tops of the ravines are limiting their view.
This must be part of the problem in that they're getting shielded from targets. We're on the wrong side of a ridge and they can't see over it. That's the only way to explain this.
Do we need to move the depression?
But we'll see if we can. I mean, there's no other way to explain him not being able to see anything. You know, they've been down there for hours and they haven't had a target.
The hull could so easily be just beyond the next hill.
Hello, ROV. This is sonar.
By 7 in the evening, even David's apparently limitless patience is wearing thin.
Hello, ROV hut. Had enough of this shit.
Get ready to pay our key.
And then, when it seems things couldn't get more frustrating, the ROV stops moving.
Was that oil that came up on the camera lens?
No, it's just dust. My initial guess is that we shagged the hydraulic pump. I think we're probably looking at the full recovery. The way she's responding, it looks like a hydraulic line may have gone or the pump was shagged for some reason.
Well, I think this dive is over.
Yet again, David is looking at a schedule that is slipping away from him. As the ROV is recovered, it soon becomes clear that it has blown a hydraulic line.
Good. Look at the damage. Okay, pull out at the light.
Luckily, the damage is not critical. The problem can be fixed, but the delay only adds to the tension. 3 miles below them, Bismarck waits to give up the secrets of her sinking. "60 years ago, Bismarck had slipped away from the ships of the Royal Navy. But she hadn't escaped their aircraft. The pilot of this plane is 82 years old. In May 1941, John Moffat was a Navy pilot on board the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. Behind this simple entry in his flying logbook is the story of a dramatic last-ditch air attack on the Bismarck.
I couldn't believe what I was feeling. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And it still haunts me. It's a terrifying sight. Terrifying.
15 pilots and their crews hurled themselves straight at the fire-spitting mountain that was Bismarck. But their breathtaking bravery was nearly marred by disaster. Admiral Lutyens on board the Bismarck had outsmarted the vastly superior forces of the British Navy for over 2 days. Then his luck had seemed to run out. The RAF had spotted Bismarck heading for France. But one by one, the chasing ships reached their fuel limits and had to turn back. Eventually, only Admiral Tovey's own ship, HMS King George V, and the cruiser Norfolk were left. But they were still over 150 miles behind Bismarck. The convoy escorts HMS Rodney and Dorsetshire, which had been diverted to the chase, were also too far away. Tovey's only hope lay with the ships from the Force H, the British Mediterranean fleet, which had been sent up from Gibraltar the previous day. They included the cruiser HMS Sheffield and the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. She carried a squadron of swordfish bombers. Despite their antiquated appearance, these canvas and wire biplanes were a pioneering design, and they were still the only aircraft that could haul a torpedo off the ship's deck. As a last-ditch effort, they were ordered to attack. The hope was they could slow Bismarck down, but the weather off the Spanish coast was abysmal.
The Ark Royal attack was absolutely astonishing because they would never normally, if it was a practice attack, they would have never taken off. I mean, they measured the amount the stern was rising and falling in this tremendous sea, and it was something like 55 feet going up and down like that.
Like many young wartime pilots, Ken Pattison had married shortly before he was sent on active duty. At the age of 24, he found himself sitting on the deck of Ark Royal in a storm, waiting to take on the most powerful German warship afloat.
I can remember, you know, sitting on the deck with the aircraft running, waiting to take off. I can remember feeling my wedding ring under my glove and thinking, I hope that I shall get back. Almost saying a little prayer. I'm not that religious, but one gets that feeling, you know.
15 swordfish headed off on a stormy 300-mile round trip to find the German warship.
When we were briefed, we were told, there's one ship out there, the Bismarck, go and sink her. But they didn't tell us the Sheffield was halfway between the Ark Royal and the Bismarck. And in the cloud and the hype conditions, the poor old leader of the flight saw this ship and said, oh, well, it must be the Bismarck. There's no other ship there. And so down we went.
In fact, Ark Royal had been told that the British cruiser HMS Sheffield was now shadowing the Bismarck. Unfortunately, the message was still sitting unread in the air squadron's in-tray. The swordfish went in to attack their own ship. Luckily, disaster was avoided. A new type of detonator had been fitted to the torpedoes. They all failed to explode.
I mean, some of them hung their heads in shame. I didn't, because I hadn't dropped my torpedo at her.
None of this was doing Admiral Tovey's blood pressure any good. Unless Bismarck's speed was reduced by midnight, his ships would have to turn home for lack of fuel. He immediately ordered the Swordfish of Force H to launch another attack. This time, the torpedoes were fitted with the old detonators.
Well, they rearmed and refueled the aircraft. We had a bite to eat, because it was late afternoon this time, and then we took off again.
With the gale still raging, the second attack took off. With it was pilot John Moffat.
And we set off in unbelievable conditions. I don't know how everybody managed to get off, but they did. Anyway, we kept going, and then the next thing we knew was these shell bursts coming through. And then that's when the commanding officer gave us a signal to go line astern. So we went line astern, the three of us, and then he gave the signal and down we went. We're firing at us right from then. And that was even in the clouds, and when we came out, that's when the things really opened up then. It was unbelievable. It was just like hail coming at you, with these tracers.
We came out of the cloud, went right down onto the water, 90 feet, 90 knots. You had to slow down because we were doing 180 knots in the dive. We had to slow down because it was no good dropping the torpedo too fast because they are almost a little bit delicate and they would break up. So, and there's no good dropping them at 800 feet either. You've got to get right down on the water. She was firing her main armament into the sea ahead of us, and we'd suddenly see great columns of spray going up.
They were like living antiques. They were flying at a speed of roughly 60 to 70 miles an hour.
There was this voice in my ears, and this was my observer, my navigator. And he was telling me, I'll tell you. And I thought, well, I couldn't understand what he was on about, you see. And I said, what's it about? And his name was Miller. And I said, what's wrong, Miller? And he says, I'll tell you when to let it go. And I thought, good Lord. You know, and next thing, I had just looked out the side of the aircraft, and there he was, hanging over the side. Yeah, I'm not kidding. I mean hanging over the side. And there he was, leaning right out, and his head down, and he kept saying, not yet, not yet. And then I realized what he was on. The idea is, you see, the sea was so bad, as you can imagine these waves, that if you didn't set that torpedo into the trough properly, if you hit the top of a wave and it porpoised, it's of no use. It wouldn't run. You had to get it so it went straight in. And he held me there. He held me far too long. It was maybe it was a few seconds, but it felt like years. But and then he just said, let her go, you know. He said, okay, and I just pressed it, and the next thing I heard him shout was, we've got a runner.
As I went in on my attack and got down, I realized she was turning to port. So I aimed well off, across ahead of her bow, dropped my fish, and then I got out of it as quick as I could.
Amazingly, every single aircraft returned to the Ark Royal with little more than minor damage. But to the pilots, it seemed that their attack on Bismarck had failed. To Admiral Tovey, the situation now looked desperate. He had only a few hours' worth of fuel left. Quiet resignation started to set in. Despite the huge efforts by the Royal Navy, it seemed Bismarck would slip the net. Then, slowly, dismay gave way to disbelief.
The Sheffield shadowing sent a signal to Tovey saying, course of Bismarck due north. Well, the course that Bismarck had been steering was roughly southeast towards Brest or Saint-Nazaire. Tovey said to his officers on the plot, I fear poor Larkham, that was the name of the captain of the Sheffield, has joined the reciprocal club, meaning that he had thought the Bismarck was going from right to left, when in fact she was going from left to right, or the other way around, which is an easy mistake to be made by an inexperienced officer. But the officers thought, poor old Larkham, to make such a balls up at this time.
We didn't know at that time that we'd hit her rudder. They couldn't understand why she was turning. They thought she was in a kind of turn to avoid torpedoes. And then the swordfish, who was shadowing, also reported the ship heading north. And they knew then that she was in trouble.
We received 2 direct hits to the rudders at the ship's rear. I realized the rudder position needle was no longer moving. The ship was no longer maneuverable.
The rudders could not be repaired. Bismarck steamed around in circles. The greatest warship afloat had been brought to heel by a tiny canvas and wire biplane. Lucien's prediction was correct. In an ocean now swept by radar and policed by aircraft, battleships could no longer hide.
So we basically drifted towards our executioner. That was the worst part of the whole operation, the certainty that we were powerless to escape our fate.
Must have been a very depressing experience. Your confidence had built up, you thought you'd shaken off the British. There was every chance of your getting back to France, getting back to safety. But then the air attack takes place, then suddenly the ship can't steer, and suddenly the mood swings. It must be one of the largest mood swings in naval history. It was impossible to keep up morale in these circumstances. Everyone, from the admiral and the captain down, sank into a sort of lassitude of depression, a sense of doom, a real sense of doom. And the atmosphere on that ship on the night of the 26th, 27th must have been extraordinary.
Otto Peters was in the engine rooms of Bismarck that night. He'd been with the ship long before she'd even been commissioned. Every day for 2 years, he walked under the Elbe River in Hamburg in this tunnel with thousands of fellow workers to the dockyards. He'd been part of the team who installed the turbine engines. Now, he was 8 decks down, awaiting his fate.
Yes, there was fear. There was fear, yes. But some of it was subconscious, so you couldn't actually pinpoint when the fear set in. But it was there. It's human. There was no doubt in our minds that the English would do whatever they could to destroy us.
The night before his death, Admiral Lutjen sent this message to shore. To the Führer of the Third Reich, we fight to the last with firm faith in you, my Führer, and with unshakable confidence in Germany's victory. He got this reply: all Germany is with you. What can be done will be done. Your devotion to duty will strengthen our people in their fight for survival. Adolf Hitler. After hurried repairs, the remotely operated vehicle, the ROV, is ready to go back in the water. This time it also carries a bronze plaque in memory of the sailors of Bismarck.
Yeah, if we take a closer look, if there's a really good landing zone, then that's fine.
David had wanted to lay the plaque on the bow of the Bismarck. With the main hull of the ship proving elusive and the fears that the weather might again turn against him, David decides to compromise.
Drop it, drop it, drop it. Good. Well done, well done. Perfect. Okay.
The plaque is placed on the biggest part of debris already found, on the superstructure near Admiral Lutjen's bridge. Then, soon after, the team locate what seems to be a huge trench dug out of the mountainside by Bismarck. The sinking hull of Bismarck hit the seabed at around 24 miles an hour. It blasted an impact crater over a mile wide into the rocky surface. But because it hit the steep slopes of an extinct underwater volcano, it started to slide. Bismarck's huge 50,000-ton heavily armored hull charged down the slope, ripping out a deep trench nearly 2 miles long. The ROV is now in that trench and heading downhill.
The road to the wreck is staring us dead in the face.
Yeah, roger that, dude. We're steady sloop with you.
Okay, thank you.
What's that, RD?
What the hell is that? What's that in front of you?
That is exactly what we've been looking for.
That's the Bismarck.
Jesus Christ. There, look at that. Swastika. Yes, right. Sir. Yeah. I was ready to go and go, what's wrong with you guys? There's drama.
There's drama.
Fantastic. Well done.
That'll make us vote, please.
The clarity of the water at 15,000 feet is breathtaking. The images of the massive ship are better than anyone had dared hope for. At last, a scientific analysis of the wreck can shed light on the historical accounts of this famous battle. As the dawn came up on the morning of Tuesday the 27th of May, the British ship started to circle Bismarck. At 08:47, they opened fire. The big battleships, HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, along with the cruisers Dorsetshire and Norfolk, launched salvo after salvo. Bismarck, unable to steer, wandered aimlessly through a firestorm.
The shells start landing, and they land in very large numbers indeed. They convert the upper part of the ship into a wreck very rapidly. They kill hundreds of members of the crew. They penetrate inside the armor on the upper works, and although they don't destroy the ship's capacity to float, they destroy the ship's capacity to fight. Within a very few minutes, one of the finest battleships in the world is converted into a useless burning wreck.
The Germans tried to respond to the British attack, but at 9:02 HMS Rodney scored a direct hit on Bismarck's front control tower. A later shell ripped out the huge hole in the bottom right of the picture. But on the front side is evidence of the first 16-inch hit, which passed straight through the armor. Bismarck's guns had now lost their main control systems. Firing of the rear guns passed to Baron Mullenheim-Reckberg in the rear gun control tower, but he only managed to fire 4 salvos.
But at that moment, we received a hit and the entire viewing equipment was blasted away. The rangefinder had been destroyed. The operators were dead. We were thrown against the side and got a bloody nose. That was my only injury during the entire incident.
This is the control tower where Mullenheim-Reckberg sat. The range-finding apparatus, which should sit on top, is completely missing. Bismarck's secondary guns were all eliminated. Each shows evidence of direct hits. Bismarck's single remaining gun, the rear turret, was obliterated by a 16-inch shell at 9:31 a.m. Bismarck's guns fell silent. Her crew were defenseless. The British continued to hurl thousands of shells at the crippled German ship for the next hour. They estimated that around 200 to 300 hit their target. Despite this, Bismarck still refused to sink.
Bismarck was built very strongly in many ways. Bismarck was a very hard ship to sink, as was proved. She was pounded in a very long, by naval battle standards, bombardment. What, an hour and a half or so? Something like that. A very long bombardment indeed, at point-blank range. And yet she didn't sink. She was put out of action, yes, but she didn't sink.
She was attacked inefficiently. The British chose, for whatever reasons, to attack the ship probably in the worst possible way if one wanted to result in a rapid sinking. There's always been some questions asked as to why the Royal Navy did not simply pull back and torpedo this essentially helpless ship. They could have sent in more strikes with swordfish very easily. They could have pulled back to 30,000 yards where penetration of the deck would have been virtually certain and probably sank the ship just as happened to Hood with 12, 15 salvos.
They weren't thinking scientifically, they were thinking instinctively. And they thought that the closer they got, the more fire they poured in, the faster the ship will sink. And all the evidence is that, in fact, they got extremely frustrated.
These probably were big gunmen, and here was their chance to use their big guns.
Virtually everyone who was on the deck of Bismarck died. Most of the survivors were men like engineers who worked below decks. The main witnesses to the horrors above decks were the British onlookers.
I saw it all. They were giving the ship a most awful pounding. Can't imagine what it must have been like on board.
The scenes of carnage on board after the battle started were really horrific. Men, friends next to them, being hit by a splinter and ripping their stomachs open and all the guts coming out, and bone and blood and all that. I mean, really horrific things. And I think that you don't expect in the course of a lifetime.
It still haunts me. Because these poor souls, they just had no chance. None. Anyway.
At 10:21, Admiral Tovey was now at his limits on fuel. There were reports of imminent German air and U-boat attacks. Much to the amazement of the Admiralty, Tovey broke off the action and headed for home. The cruiser HMS Dorsetshire was ordered to torpedo the Bismarck.
And this caused a tremendous crisis between Tovey and Churchill. Tovey sailed away with the ship still afloat. And this caused, well, it wasn't just a frisson with Churchill, it was a frisson with Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord. Other people in the Navy thought, you can't sail away and leave an enemy battleship still on the surface. But he did, and he left Dorsetshire to have a go with torpedoes at very close range.
But the evidence of the expedition now suggests Tovey's decision was not so strange. It's clear from a detailed examination of the hull that the handful of torpedoes the British had already fired had had a much greater effect than previously believed. Earlier in the action, HMS Rodney and Norfolk had fired 4 torpedoes each at Bismarck's starboard side. The survey of the hull revealed at least 4 out of the 8 hit. One tore open Bismarck's weaker underbelly and prized apart these 13-inch thick side armor plates. The resulting flooding would have been devastating. Tovey may well have seen that Bismarck was going to sink.
We now think that a torpedo from Dorsetshire came in about here and actually exploded on the main deck here.
Causing huge damage, of course, because of the size of the warhead.
Below the waterline, when one takes torpedo hits, the flooding is restricted by compartmentation. Up above in the main deck and what we call, in the U.S. Navy at least, the second deck area, that's all more or less wide open, and once water gets in there, it floods freely throughout the ship. So once a ship gets to that point, she doesn't come back.
The conclusion of the expedition is that Bismarck was indeed sunk by British torpedoes. If the Germans did open the Seacocks to scuttle Bismarck, as some anecdotal evidence from survivors claimed, it only hastened the inevitable. Towards the end of the action, the Swordfish from Ark Royal had hoped to finish off the Bismarck. But the planes from the Mediterranean-based force were not welcomed by the home fleet. Bismarck was their prize. Revenge for sinking the Hood. The planes were fired on by ships of their own side.
I think it was the Dorsetshire gave us a broadside when we were about to attack. That's probably the fact that we were a different force in wrong waters. We understood that when we got back, because that was revenge for the Hood.
As the planes flew away at 10:38, Bismarck started to roll over. The men from below decks now tried to escape.
Das war dann eben nun wirklich der Punkt, wo man nun wirklich.
And well, it was then that we finally knew that we really did have to leave the ship.
Berge von Toten.
And there were mountains of dead bodies. It was a horrifying sight.
Es waren Hunderte von Toten und
There were hundreds of dead bodies, and the ship had almost sunk by the time I reached the upper deck. The waves were crashing overhead, and it's really terrible to see people with the blood all washed out of them and only their flesh remaining.
Bismarck had a crew of 2,500 men. 800 men got away as she sank. This photograph taken from the Dorsetshire shows the survivors swimming towards the British ship. Dorsetshire and the destroyer Maori moved in to rescue the German sailors. But shortly after the ships came to a halt, there was a warning of a U-boat attack.
I was utterly horrified when all of a sudden we set off again and I realized that the others were not going to be rescued. Although I was unaware of it at the time, I had been one of the last to be rescued.
All warships were under strict orders to move off. To be static in the water near a submarine was considered suicidal.
It was awful. And that same feeling of compassion, which the Germans had found when they saw the Hood disappear, were replicated by us in the British ships. Was just the same sort of feelings the Germans had. It's this thing of the comradeship of the sea. It's a very instinctive thing.
Of the 800 German sailors who had survived the shelling, nearly 700 were left in the water. Otto Hunch was an anti-aircraft gunner on Bismarck. He was one of a handful of men from above decks who had found cover and avoided the wholesale carnage happening all around him.
Es ist höchstens nachher gewesen.
The actual drama
didn't begin until my fellow soldiers were in the water, and the Dorsetshire, or whatever the cruiser was called, sailed off. Sailed off without rescuing any more men. It was traumatic for those soldiers. It was cruel, and I don't know. I can't imagine that a German submarine commander, that he would have sabotaged the rescue attempt by firing torpedoes at the ship, at the British ship. I can't imagine that.
Somehow, he and 2 others had managed to get an inflatable life raft under cover too and protect it throughout the battle. As Bismarck sank, they set off into the massive Atlantic swells. But it was an almost impossible task to stay in the raft.
Before 1900 hours, I had decided that it was futile to go on like that, and I had taken off my life jacket. I said, the next time we capsize, I won't struggle to get back. But my fellow soldiers won me around, saying that we should hold out, which is what we ended up doing. At 1900 hours, the submarine arrived.
After 9 hours in the water, Wunsch and his 2 companions were picked up by a German U-boat sent to look for survivors. They were the only ones found. The other 700 sailors who survived the battle had slipped beneath the mountainous waves. No one knows how Admiral Lutyens met his death.
My father always had his gold watch with him, a pocket watch with a spring lid. But this time he had left it behind, saying that it was to be given to me should he not return. Those were the last words I heard him say. One morning my mother came in and told me that my father was dead and that I didn't have to go to school. That was that. Then we heard it on the radio. That was all we knew.
Winston Churchill was in the House of Commons at the time, and somebody handed him a piece of paper, and he said, I've just received news that the Bismarck had been sunk. And everybody cheered, except for one man, that was Harold Nicholson, the writer, who was a member of Parliament. And he, more than most, sensed the human tragedy and the loss of so many lives. 4,000 sailors on the 2 sides, including 2 admirals, died.
112 Bismarck survivors were landed at Newcastle and spent the rest of the war in camps in Canada. Today, many of those who remain meet at the memorial to their lost shipmates in the Bismarck family estate near Hamburg. With them are some of the men who sank them. Together, both sides still remember the 4,000 men of Hood and Bismarck who died. Although they didn't realize it at the time, these men took part in one of the last chapters of the battleship era. Such huge gunships were never built again. The Battle of the Hood and Bismarck proved that even the most powerful weapons either side possessed could now be destroyed by something smaller, cheaper, and more mobile. Soon aircraft would come to dominate naval warfare. This expedition has reopened that chapter of history and found new answers to unsolved mysteries. The men who served and died in Hood and Bismarck have not been forgotten. The world has been able to gaze once more upon these enormous feats of engineering, the ships that ruled the waves in the age of the battleship.